August 1887, western Missouri Ozark borderlands. While every settler in the township dug their wells 15 to 25 feet deep and called it done, one Norwegian immigrant kept digging. Lars Halvorsen went down 63 feet through limestone ridge, 4 feet wide, stone-lined with blocks 6 to 9 inches thick. 46 days of labor. His neighbors called him Hole Digger Halvorsen. They said he was chasing ghosts in the rock. A local storekeeper told him he could have dug 5 wells instead of 1 full pit. They measured their own shallow wells proudly, claimed Lars overbuilt, overthought, and brought foreign nonsense to Missouri. Then 1888 arrived. The hardest summer drought on record. Rainfall 40% below average. Creeks dropped 2 to 3 feet by June, bone dry by July. Neighbors' wells dropped to 10 to 20% of normal volume. 11 went completely dry. But Lars's well? Water level dropped less than 2 inches. 140 to 160 gallons every single day. 52 degrees, clear and steady. What did he understand about reading limestone, underground channels, and subsurface water flow that everyone else dismissed as far in excess? And how did the Fool's Hole become the only reliable water source for 19 families fighting to survive? If you respect real stories that carry lessons worth passing on, make sure to subscribe. There are more historical accounts ahead. Comment your city and time so we know where this documentary found you. August 1887 marked the completion of Lars Halvorsen's cabin on a limestone ridge in western Missouri, 3 miles north of the nearest township settlement. The structure itself followed standard frontier practice. 3 rooms of hand-hewn oak logs, chinked with lime mortar and clay, a stone chimney rising from the western wall. But at the center of the main room sat something that violated every assumption his neighbors held about reasonable labor. The well shaft descended 63 feet through solid limestone, 4 feet in diameter, lined with fitted stone blocks that Lars had quarried, shaped, and mortared into place over 46 days of continuous work. The digging had begun in late June of 1881. Immediately after Lars raised the cabin frame, he'd chosen the site carefully, spending 3 evenings walking the ridge after sunset, pressing his ear to limestone outcrops, listening for the faint sound of water moving through subterranean channels. He'd learned the technique in Telemark, Norway, where glacial meltwater carved hidden rivers through karstone, and where a well digger's reputation rested on his ability to find flow rather than mere storage. On the 4th evening, he marked a spot where cool air rose from a ground, fissure after dark, and where moisture beaded on exposed limestone faces even during dry weeks. His neighbors watched him pace and listen, and they began calling him peculiar before he ever set a spade to earth. The first 20 feet went quickly, loose soil and fractured stone that yielded to pick and shovel. But at 22 feet, Lars hit consolidated limestone, dense and gray, and the work slowed to inches per day. He used a drilling hammer and star bit to bore shot holes, filled them with black powder charges, and blasted downward in controlled increments. Each blast required hauling rubble up in canvas buckets, a process that consumed hours. His neighbors, most of whom had struck water between 15 and 25 feet, watched the labor pile up and calculated the waste. Thomas Bracken, a second-generation Missouri farmer whose own well had cost him 8 days of digging, stood at the edge of Lars's shaft in mid-July and pronounced the work foolish. "You've got water at 18 feet, Bracken said, gesturing at the seepage pooling at the bottom. Any man with sense stops when he strikes wet rock. Lars kept digging by early August. The shaft reached 40 feet, and the mockery intensified. A local storekeeper named William Cass made a public show of calculating the hours Lars had invested, announcing to the Saturday market crowd that Halvorsen could have dug 5 wells in the time he'd wasted on one. Old Digger Halvorsen, Cass called him, and the name stuck. A township trustee named Jacob Stern visited the site and warned Lars that deep wells invited cave-ins and bad air, carbon dioxide that pooled in confined spaces and killed men without warning. Stern claimed to know of 3 diggers who died in shafts deeper than 30 feet, though he offered no names or dates. Lars listened politely, then descended into the shaft with a candle and a length of rope tied to his waist. If the flame guttered, he climbed out and waited for the air to clear. At 48 feet, the candle died 3 times in one morning, and Lars paused the dig for 9 days, until natural ventilation restored breathable conditions. The stone lining distinguished Lars's well as much as its depth. Most frontier wells use dry stacked fieldstone or simple timber cribbing, structures adequate for shallow shafts, but prone to collapse under the weight and water pressure found at greater depths. Lars cut limestone blocks 6 to 9 inches thick, shaped them with a mason's hammer until they fit together with minimal gaps, and mortared each course with lime and sand mix that cured hard as the native rock. He staggered the blocks in overlapping patterns, ensuring no vertical seam ran more than 2 courses without interruption, a technique that distributed weight and prevented shear failure. The work required precision that frontier builders rarely practiced. Each block had to be lowered by rope, positioned, checked for level, and mortared before the next course began. Neighbors who visited the site saw the meticulous stonework and called it overbuilt. Several measured their own wells and recited the numbers with pride. 20 feet, 22 feet, 18 feet. Claiming Lars had brought foreign nonsense to Missouri and overthought a simple task. Lars rarely responded to the criticism. He was 47 years old, a man who'd spent 2 decades maintaining farm wells in Norway's karst valleys. And he understood that subsurface water behaved differently depending on whether it came from static storage or moving channels. Static water, rainwater that percolated into porous stone and pooled in natural voids, dropped during droughts because it had no replenishment. Channel water, flow that moved laterally through underground conduits, remained steady because it drew from distant sources, sometimes miles away. The signs Lars had read on the ridge suggested channel water, the cool drafts at night, the moisture on stone faces, the hollow sound when he struck bedrock with a hammer. These were indicators of void space below, of water moving rather than sitting. But explaining this to men who measured success by speed and shallow results proved futile, so Lars kept digging. At 58 feet, the drilling hammer broke through into open space. Lars heard the change immediately, a hollow crack instead of the dull thud of solid stone. He cleared the rubble and found a horizontal fissure, 6 inches wide, through which water trickled at a rate he estimated near 2 gallons per hour. The flow was cold, clear, and constant. He dug another 5 feet to ensure stability, then installed a 14-foot perforated oak crib at the bottom, a cylindrical structure that allowed water to enter laterally while filtering out silt and stone fragments. The crib sat on a gravel bed Lars had hauled down in buckets, and the water rose to within 8 inches of the ground level. Lit by mid-September, the well's completion coincided with the first frost. Neighbors came to see the finished work, more out of curiosity than respect. They peered into the shaft, noted the stone lining that descended beyond the reach of lamplight, and shook their heads. Bracken called it a monument to wasted effort. Cass joked that Lars had dug halfway to hell for water he could have reached in a week. But the well held steady at 150 gallons per day through autumn, and the water stayed cold and clear, even as surface creeks warmed and muddied with seasonal rains. Lars drew his daily supply with a rope and bucket, and he said nothing about the underground channel he'd intersected or the flow he expected would outlast every shallow well in the township. The ridge stood quiet through winter, and the cabin with its stone-lined shaft waited for the test. That would come with summer. The spring of 1888 arrived with normal rainfall through April. but May brought the first signs of trouble. Precipitation totals fell 40% below the 20-year average, and by early June, the creeks that fed the township's livestock and irrigation had dropped 2 feet from their seasonal highs. Farmers noted the decline but expressed no immediate alarm. Dry spells were common enough in the Missouri borderlands, and most assumed the pattern would break with summer thunderstorms. But the thunderstorms never came. July arrived with cloudless skies and temperatures climbing past 95 degrees for days at a stretch. The creeks dropped another foot, exposing gravel bars that hadn't seen sunlight in living memory. And several smaller tributaries stopped flowing altogether. Wells across the township began failing in predictable sequence. The shallowest went first. Shafts dug to 15 or 18 feet that had always provided adequate water suddenly yielded half their normal volume. Then a quarter, then nothing but damp mud at the bottom. Families who'd relied on these wells for years found themselves hauling water from creeks that were themselves dropping daily. By mid-July, 11 wells in the immediate area had gone completely dry, their stone-lined or timber-cribbed shafts standing empty while livestock bellowed for water and garden crops withered in the fields. 6 more wells continued producing, but at rates so diminished, less than 10 gallons per day in most cases, that families had to ration drinking water and abandon any thought of irrigation. Thomas Bracken's well, which had served his family reliably since 1879, dropped to 20% of its normal yield by the first week of July. He deepened the shaft another 4 feet using pick and shovel, hoping to reach a lower water table, but found only damp limestone that yielded perhaps 3 gallons overnight. His wife began rationing wash water, and his children walked a mile each morning to a creek that still held stagnant pools green with algae. Other families adopted similar measures, hauling water in barrels, bathing once a week instead of twice, letting laundry accumulate until they could justify the expenditure of precious gallons. Livestock suffered more visibly. Horses and cattle that once drank freely now crowded around diminished troughs, and farmers calculated how many animals they could keep alive on drastically reduced supplies. The township's aggregate livestock mortality spiked in August, with county records later documenting losses that exceeded normal rates by 30 to 40%. Lars Halvorson's well behaved differently. Through May, June, and into July, the water level dropped less than 2 inches from its spring high. Lars measured the depth daily using a weighted cord marked at 6-inch intervals, and the consistency puzzled him initially. He'd expected some decline, given the surface conditions. But the flow remained steady at 140 to 160 gallons per day, more than sufficient for his household needs, his garden, and the small herd of cattle he kept on the ridge. The water temperature held constant at 52 to 54 degrees, noticeably colder than the ambient air and far colder than the tepid liquid other families drew from shallow wells. The coolness confirmed what Lars had suspected during the digging. His well intersected a subsurface channel, a moving body of water that originated miles away and traveled through limestone conduits, independent of surface rainfall. The geology underlying the ridge explained the phenomenon, though few settlers understood the mechanics. Limestone formed from ancient seabeds, compressed and hardened over millions of years, was inherently porous. Rainwater that fell across a wide area, sometimes 10 or 15 miles distant, percolated downward through soil and fractured rock until it reached consolidated limestone layers. There, instead of pooling in static voids, the water followed natural pathways carved by millennia of erosion, moving laterally through channels that ranged from fissures inches wide to caverns large enough to walk through. These channels acted as underground rivers, slow but persistent, fed by distant rainfall and insulated from short-term drought by the sheer volume of their drainage area. A well that intersected such a channel drew from this dynamic flow rather than from static storage, and its yield remained stable even when surface conditions deteriorated. Normal wells, by contrast, tapped static storage, pockets of water trapped in porous rock that replenished only when rainfall percolated directly above them. During drought, these pockets shrank as water drained away faster than precipitation could replace it, and wells went dry in sequence from shallowest to deepest. Lars's deeper excavation had punched through the static zone entirely, reaching the moving channel below, and the channel's flow continued regardless of local conditions. But this explanation, rooted in geological observation and subsurface hydrology, found no purchase among neighbors who attributed the well's performance to luck, supernatural intervention, or simple fluke. William Cass, the storekeeper who'd mocked the digging, claimed the well sat above a underground lake that'll run dry come August. Jacob Stern suggested the site was haunted, a notion rooted more in superstition than reason, but one that gained traction among families desperate to explain why their own wells had failed. By late July, families began arriving at Lars's cabin in the evenings, asking quietly if they could borrow water. Lars gave freely, drawing bucket after bucket and filling whatever containers his neighbors brought: clay jugs, wooden barrels, canvas bags stitched watertight with pine pitch. He asked no payment and offered no lectures, though he occasionally pointed out the signs he'd read before digging: the cool drafts, the moisture on stone, the hollow sound of voids below. Most listened politely and thanked him, but few grasped the principles underlying his method. They saw results without understanding cause, and they framed the well's success in terms of fortune rather than technique. L.A. Matthews, a small stock farmer whose own well had dropped to a trickle, paid closer attention. He returned several evenings, watching Lars draw water and noting the stone lining's thickness, the shaft's unusual diameter, the careful mortaring that prevented collapse. Matthews asked questions about airflow and limestone behavior, and Lars answered in practical terms, describing how he'd tested for carbon dioxide and chosen his depth based on auditory cues. Matthews absorbed the information without judgment, filing it away against future need. The drought deepened through August. Temperatures exceeded 100 degrees for 3 consecutive days, and the last running creek in the township stopped flowing on September 3rd. Families faced acute water scarcity for the first time in settlement memory, and the social dynamics shifted. Men who called Lars a fool now sought his guidance, asking how he'd known where to dig and whether their own wells could be deepened or reinforced. Lars explained his method step by step, reading ground signs, listening for subsurface flow, digging deep enough to intersect channels rather than static storage. But the explanations came too late for immediate relief. Wells couldn't be deepened quickly during crisis, and families had to survive on ration supplies and shared water from the one source that hadn't failed. The ridge, once isolated and dismissed, became the township's lifeline, and the man they'd mocked became the only reason some families kept their livestock alive through the hardest summer anyone could remember. September 3rd, 1888 marked the day the last running creek in the township stopped flowing. Families who'd relied on its diminished current for washing and livestock watering arrived at dawn to find only stagnant pools, filmed with green algae and crusted with white mineral deposits. Horses sniffed the water and refused to drink. Cattle stood at the creek bed lowing, their ribs visible through hide, stretched tight by weeks of reduced forage and rationed water. The temperature climbed to 102 degrees by midday and held there for 3 consecutive days, baking the soil until it cracked in geometric patterns and turning what remained of pasture grass to brittle straw that crumbled underfoot. Water usage calculations became a matter of survival arithmetic. Each family required 15 to 25 gallons per day at minimum, drinking water for adults and children, cooking, basic washing, and minimal livestock maintenance. Multiply that by 19 families in the immediate area, and the daily demand approached 400 gallons, a volume that exceeded the combined output of every functioning well in the township. 11 wells had gone completely dry by late August. 6 more produced less than 10 gallons per day, barely enough to keep a single family alive and useless for livestock. The mathematics pointed toward crisis within days, and families began making hard decisions about which animals to slaughter before thirst killed them and rendered the meat unsafe. Thomas Bracken arrived at Lars Halvorson's cabin on the morning of September 4th with a canvas tarp and 6 empty barrels. He'd walked the 3 miles from his homestead in heat that shimmered above the wagon road, and when Lars met him at the door, Bracken spoke without preamble. "I need water for my stock," he said. "I can pay you in labor or goods, but I need 40 gallons today, or I lose 3 head of cattle." Lars gestured toward the well and helped Bracken lower buckets into the shaft, drawing water that came up cold and clear, the temperature steady at 52 degrees despite the furnace heat above ground. They filled the barrels in silence, and when the work was done, Bracken stood staring into the shaft for a long moment before speaking again. "You tried to tell us," he said, "about the depth, about reading the stone. I thought you were wasting time." Lars said nothing, only handed Bracken the rope for hauling the barrels onto the tarp for dragging home. The social reversal accelerated over the following week. Men who called Lars Hole Digger Halvorsen and mocked his 46 days of labor now asked for guidance on deepening their own wells or identifying better sites. Lars walked their properties in the evenings after the heat broke, pressing his ear to limestone outcrops, listening for the faint sound of water moving through hidden channels. He showed them how to test for cool drafts rising from ground fissures after sunset, how to watch for moisture that beaded on stone faces even during dry periods, how to tap bedrock with a hammer and distinguish between the dull thud of solid formation and the hollow ring that suggested void space below. The technique seemed foreign to men raised on frontier pragmatism, but desperation made them attentive students. Eli Matthews followed Lars through these evening surveys, taking notes in a leather-bound journal, sketching the ridge topography and marking sites where Lars identified promising indicators. Lars explained the mechanics of his well construction with the same practical precision he'd applied to the digging. The stone lying 6 to 9 inch thickness wasn't decorative excess. It provided structural stability necessary at depths beyond 60 feet, where water pressure and earth weight could collapse thinner walls. He'd chosen a 4-foot diameter because narrower shafts choked lateral flow and made collapse more likely, while wider shafts required exponentially more stone and labor without proportional benefit. The staggered limestone courses distributed weight and prevented vertical seams from creating sheer planes where failure could propagate. Each block had been cut to fit its neighbors with minimal gaps, and the lime and sand mortar cured hard enough to bond the structure into a single load-bearing column. At the bottom, the 14-foot perforated oak crib served dual purposes. It allowed water to flow in laterally from the intersected channel while filtering out silt and stone fragments that would otherwise cloud the supply. The crib's construction had required precision Lars didn't often see in frontier carpentry. He'd split white oak logs into staves 3 inches thick, beveled the edges to create a cylindrical form, and drilled 1/4-inch holes at 6-inch intervals around the circumference. Iron hoops held the staves together under pressure, and the entire assembly sat on a gravel bed that provided drainage and prevented silt accumulation. Water entered through the perforations, rose through the gravel, and filled the main shaft at a rate determined by the channel's flow velocity. During the drought, as surface water disappeared and underground channels accelerated, a documented effect where reduced aquifer volume increased flow speed through remaining conduits. The well's yield actually increased slightly, rising from 150 gallons per day in May to 180 by early September. William Cass, the storekeeper who'd popularized the hole digger nickname, came to Lars in mid-September asking about well reinforcement. His own shaft, dug to 22 feet in 1883, had produced reliably until July, but now sat dry except for a few inches of muddy seepage. Cass wanted to know if deepening would help or if the site was simply exhausted. Lars descended into the well with a candle and a hammer, tapping the bottom and listening for echoes. He climbed out and told Cass the truth. The site showed no signs of subsurface channels. Deepening might reach static water storage at 40 or 50 feet, but without a moving channel, the water would drain during extended drought just as the shallow pocket had. Cass asked where he should dig instead, and Lars walked the property until he found a spot where cool air rose from a fissure near a limestone shelf. "Here," Lars said. 60 feet minimum. Stone-lined all the way. Oak crib at the bottom. Cass calculated the labor and cost, then asked if Lars would supervise the work for wages. Lars agreed. Jacob Stern, the township trustee who'd warned about bad air and cave-ins, visited the Halvorsen cabin in late September with a formal apology. He'd lost 6 cattle to thirst and dehydration, and his family had survived only by hauling water from Lars's well 3 times per week. Stern admitted he'd been wrong about the dangers of deep digging and asked Lars to advise the township on water management for future dry years. Lars declined any formal position, but offered to share his methods with anyone willing to learn. The knowledge, he said, belonged to the land and to anyone patient enough to read what the land revealed. Stern recorded this conversation in township minutes dated September 28, 1888, noting that Halvorsen's well had maintained flow sufficient to supply upwards of 12 families and their stock through the worst drought in settlement memory. By October, livestock losses across the township had stabilized as families organized a strict rotation for water access at the ridge. Lars's well produced enough for communal use, and neighbors helped each other haul barrels along the wagon roads. The immediate crisis had passed, but the lesson remained fresh. Shallow wells and surface water couldn't be trusted during extreme conditions. And the techniques Lars had brought from Norway, deep excavation, channel interception, stone line stability, represented survival knowledge that frontier convention had dismissed as foreign access until the land itself proved otherwise. Charles Winford arrived in the township on October 19, 1888, traveling the county survey circuit with a leather satchel of instruments and a reputation for geological curiosity that exceeded his official duties. He trained at the Missouri School of Mines in Rolla, studying under professors who'd mapped the state's lead deposits and documented the karst formations underlying much of the Ozark Plateau. His surveying work paid the bills, but his interest lay in understanding how water moved through limestone country. And he'd heard rumors of a well that maintained steady flow through the summer's catastrophic drought. Jacob Stern had written to him in September, describing the Halvorsen well and requesting a professional assessment of its unusual performance. Winford spent the first morning at the ridge taking measurements. He lowered a weighted tin cylinder into the shaft on a marked rope, counting the seconds until he heard the splash, then calculating depth based on gravitational drop. The cylinder struck water at 58 feet, confirming Lars's own measurements, and continued another 5 feet to the bottom. Winford noted the shaft's diameter, 4 feet, precisely maintained from top to bottom, and the stone lining's uniform thickness. He struck the limestone blocks with a steel rod, listening to the tone, testing for voids or cracks that might compromise structural integrity. The masonry held solid throughout, each course mortared tight and staggered to distribute load. He descended into the well, using a rope ladder Lars had rigged for maintenance, carrying a candle and a notebook, and examined the bottom construction by lamplight. The oak crib impressed him immediately. 14 feet of perforated white oak staves, bound with iron hoops and seated on a gravel bed that showed careful gradation. Larger stones at the bottom for drainage, finer material above for filtration. Winford counted the quarter-inch perforations drilled at 6-inch intervals around the cylinder's circumference, a pattern that maximized lateral water entry while maintaining structural strength. He placed his palm against the wood and felt the coolness of water flowing through from beyond the shaft's confines. The sensation confirmed what he'd suspected from surface observations. This well intercepted a subsurface channel, not a static pocket. He climbed out, recorded his findings, and asked Lars to describe the site selection process. Lars explained the indicators he'd used, the cool drafts at night, the moisture on exposed limestone, the hollow sound when tapping bedrock. Winford recognized these as empirical methods for detecting void space and water movement, techniques that paralleled the theoretical geology he'd studied, but expressed in the practical language of a man who'd learned by experience rather than textbooks. He asked Lars about drilling depth and timing, and Lars described the 46 days of excavation, the carbon dioxide pauses, the moment at 58 feet when the hammer broke through into open fissure. Winford pulled a geological survey map from his satchel and spread it across Lars's kitchen table, tracing the known limestone formations that underlay the region. The Springfield Plateau, he explained, was riddled with subsurface conduits carved over millennia by water dissolving calcium carbonate and creating channels that ranged from hairline cracks to caverns large enough to explore on foot. Winford's investigation extended beyond mere depth confirmation. He conducted echo tests, dropping stones into the well and timing the sound delay between impact and return. The echoes suggested significant void space below the crib, consistent with a horizontal conduit extending laterally from the shaft. He measured water temperature at multiple depths using a mercury thermometer suspended on a cord, finding consistent readings between 52 and 54 degrees from top to bottom. This uniformity indicated active flow, water that moved through the system rather than sitting stagnant. Static water would show thermal stratification, with warmer liquid near the surface and cooler at depth. The absence of stratification confirmed the channel hypothesis. On October 22nd, Winford drafted a formal report for the county surveyor's office. He described the Halvorsen well as intersecting a subsidiary karst conduit approximately 60 feet below surface grade, part of the larger aquifer system that drained the northern Ozark borderlands. He estimated the channel's flow strength at 2 to 3 gallons per minute, based on the well's daily yield and the recharge rate he'd observed during his visit. The water's clarity measured 2 to 3 nephelometric turbidity units, exceptionally clean for the period and indicative of natural limestone filtration. Hardness tests showed measurably lower mineral content than typical shallow wells, another characteristic of conduit water that traveled long distances through porous stone and picked up less dissolved calcium than water sitting in static contact with limestone walls. Winford introduced the term perennial conduit well to describe Lars's achievement, distinguishing it from conventional groundwater wells that tapped static storage. The distinction carried practical implications for anyone attempting to replicate the method. Perennial conduit wells required deeper excavation, typically 50 to 70 feet in the Ozark karst belt, and precise site selection based on surface indicators of subsurface flow. They also demanded structural engineering beyond frontier norms, stone lining thick enough to withstand depth pressure, mortar work that prevented seepage and collapse, and bottom cribbing that allowed lateral flow without silt intrusion. The investment in time and materials exceeded conventional practice by factors of 3 to 5. But the payoff came during drought years when Shallow wells failed and conduit wells continued, producing. The vindication that Winford's report provided carried weight beyond personal validation for Lars. The measurements transformed anecdotal success into documented fact. Lars's well produced 150 to 180 gallons daily through the peak of drought, while average neighboring wells produced 0 to 20 gallons. Water clarity and temperature remained constant regardless of surface conditions. The method proved repeatable in principle, depending on correct site selection and proper construction technique rather than luck or supernatural favor. Thomas Bracken, reading Winford's summary at the township meeting in November, acknowledged publicly that he dismissed scientific principle in favor of expedient labor, and that his family had survived the summer only because Lars ignored conventional wisdom. Eli Matthews used Winford's findings to justify his own well project. Begun in late October on a site Lars had identified 2 miles east of the ridge. Matthews hired 2 laborers and commenced digging, following Lars's specifications for diameter, stone lining, and depth targeting. By December, they'd reached 52 feet and struck a lateral fissure that yielded clear water at approximately 1 gallon per minute. Matthews installed a perforated oak crib modeled on Lars's design and completed the stone lining through January of 1889. His well maintained steady flow through the following summer, which brought normal rainfall, and proved its worth during the drought of 1891 when shallow wells again failed, and Matthews supplied 4 neighboring families from his own shaft. Winford's report circulated through county surveyor networks and reached the Missouri School of Mines library by spring of 1889. Geology students studied it as an example of practical hydrology applied in frontier conditions, and the term perennial conduit well entered regional vocabulary as a designation for deep wells that intersected subsurface channels. The documentation ensured that Lars's method existed as recorded knowledge rather than isolated success, available to anyone willing to study the principles and invest the necessary labor. The years following the drought of 1888 marked a quiet transformation in township water management practices. 6 families undertook deep well projects between 1889 and 1895, each guided by the principles Lars had demonstrated and Charles Winford had documented. Average well depth across the settlement increased from 20 feet to a range of 45 to 60 feet, and 3 of the new excavations struck reliable subsurface flow to maintain yield through subsequent dry years. The shift occurred without formal mandate or organized campaign. Simply the accumulated weight of families who'd watched their shallow wells fail while Lars's deep shaft continued producing, and who decided that 46 days of careful labor represented insurance worth purchasing. William Cass completed his new well in April of 1889, sinking a shaft 57 feet into the limestone shelf Lars had identified on his property. Cass hired 2 experienced stone masons from the county seat to ensure proper lining technique, and he purchased white oak staves from a sawmill 30 miles south to construct a perforated crib matching Lars's specifications. The work consumed 63 days and cost Cass more than twice what he'd invested in his original shallow well. But the shaft struck a lateral fissure at 54 feet and yielded water at 120 gallons per day. When drought returned in 1891, less severe than 1888, but still sufficient to drop creek levels by half, Cass's deep, well-maintained flow, while his abandoned shallow shaft remained dry. He never again spoke of Lars's method as far in excess. Thomas Bracken waited until 1892 to dig deeper, haunted by the memory of his cattle dying while water flowed 3 miles away. He chose a site near his existing homestead where Lars detected faint cool drafts rising from fractured bedrock in the evenings. Bracken did most of the excavation himself, working through late summer and autumn. blasting through consolidated limestone with black powder charges and hauling rubble in canvas buckets. At 48 feet, he struck a narrow channel that produced approximately 80 gallons daily, enough for his household and stock with modest surplus. The well's completion restored his sense of security, and he taught his sons the site selection techniques Lars had shared, listening for subsurface flow, watching for moisture indicators, testing for void space through percussion. The knowledge passed from one generation to the next as practical inheritance more valuable than land title or cash savings. Eli Matthews became the method's most dedicated advocate, documenting his own well projects in the leather journal he'd carried during evening surveys with Lars. Matthews dug 3 additional wells between 1890 and 1895, 2 on his own expanded property and 1 for his eldest daughter's homestead 5 miles south. Each shaft reached depths between 50 and 62 feet and 2 intersected productive channels. Matthews recorded construction details with precision that rivaled Winford's geological reports: stone lining thickness, mortar composition, crib perforation patterns, daily yield measurements. His journal circulated among neighbors as an informal construction manual, and by the mid-90s, several families referenced Matthews's notes when planning their own deep wells. The information spread through demonstration and shared documentation rather than institutional teaching, a grassroots technical literacy that emerged from necessity and mutual aid. Lars's cabin became an informal gathering point during dry seasons, not because Lars sought recognition, but because his well represented the most reliable water source within a radius that expanded as the township grew. Travelers passing through the region in 1893 and 1894 remarked on the stone-lined shaft and the cold, clear water that never seemed to diminish regardless of surface conditions. A circuit-riding Methodist minister who stopped at the ridge in July of 1894 wrote in his diary about the endless. Well, that sustained a community, describing how families traveled from as far as 6 miles to draw water during a 6-week drought. Lars charged nothing for access, maintaining only that visitors bring their own rope and buckets to avoid wear on his equipment. The generosity became local legend, though Lars himself dismissed the attention, saying the water belonged to the land and he merely intercepted it on its journey through stone. County records from the 1890s show a measurable decline in water. Scarcity reports following the adoption of deeper well practices. Townships that had filed multiple drought-related petitions for aid during the 1880s submitted fewer complaints in the following decade, even though rainfall patterns remained variable. The correlation between deep well construction and reduced scarcity wasn't lost on county administrators, who began recommending minimum depths of 40 to 50 feet in official homesteading guidance. The recommendations drew directly from Winford's 1888 report and from accumulated field observations of which wells survived drought and which failed. By 1897, the shift in practice had become standard enough that newcomers to the region dug deep as a matter of course, often unaware they were following methods that had been mocked less than 10 years earlier. Lars died in March of 1903 at age 63, his health declining after a winter illness he couldn't shake. His daughter Ruth, 28 years old and thoroughly trained in her father's methods, inherited the cabin and the well. She'd grown up hauling water from the stone-lined shaft, learning to inspect the limestone courses for cracks or erosion, checking the oak crib annually for rot or damage, measuring depth and yield as routine maintenance tasks. Ruth continued her father's practice of open access during dry years, and she taught neighboring families how to identify favorable sites using the same ground-reading techniques Lars had brought from Norway. Her instruction focused on observable indicators rather than theoretical geology: where to listen for subsurface flow, how to interpret moisture patterns on rock faces, what hollow percussion sounds meant when testing bedrock. The knowledge survived because it proved useful season after season, drought after drought. A county survey conducted in 1912, 9 years after Lars's death, documented the well's continued performance. The surveyor noted that the water level remained within 10 inches of the surface year-round. That daily yield averaged 160 gallons, and that the stone lining showed minimal deterioration despite 3 decades of use. Local residents still referred to it as the Endless Well, though by 1912, the novelty had faded and deep conduit wells had become common enough that Lars's original achievement seemed less remarkable than it had in 1888. The survey report mentioned Lars by name only once, identifying him as the Norwegian settler who first demonstrated perennial conduit well construction in this township, a description that reduced 46 days of mock labor to a single technical phrase. Modern geological surveys conducted in the late 20th century mapped the aquifer system underlying the northern Ozark borderlands and confirmed that a major subsurface conduit passes within 40 to 60 feet of the surface, along the limestone ridge where Lars built his cabin. Hydrologists studying the maps noted that Lars's well sits directly above a reliable feeder channel, its location chosen through empirical observation decades before scientific instruments could measure or confirm such features. The precision of his site selection, achieved with nothing more than careful attention to ground indicators and knowledge carried from another continent, validated methods that contemporary frontier settlers had dismissed as overthought foreign excess. When you work with nature instead of against it, deep preparation becomes the difference between having water for one season and having water for every season that follows.